The job was simple at first glance. It seemed like the kind of work I could handle without much thought. Night security at a newly built airport. The place was vast, gleaming under the sterile lights, and it was quiet. So quiet that, by the time I'd walked through its sprawling terminals, I'd learned something odd about the place. It felt almost like a ghost town, as if it wasn't even open yet, though it was ready to be. It was pristine and empty, and at first it was peaceful, too peaceful. Like a place meant to be lived in, but left untouched by life itself. I'd been told that I was joining a skeleton crew, just me and a handful of janitors and maintenance staff working the graveyard shift. The airport wasn't open to the public yet, so most of the terminals sat in quiet disuse, with only a few scattered workers rushing through the halls, doing their jobs. But there was something different about this place, something that didn't feel quite right. The first time I stepped inside the security office, I noticed it immediately. "Here," the manager said, handing me a laminated sheet of paper. "These are the rules. Follow them, and you'll be fine." He didn't even look at me as he said it, his eyes glued to the monitor in front of him. I took the sheet with a nod, pretending not to notice the discomfort that ran through me. I stared at the list, the instructions written in black ink. They looked like any other typical workplace regulations, but there was an eerie undercurrent to them that made me uneasy. Rule 1. Don't approach the planes parked at Gate 6, no matter how empty they look. Rule 2. If you hear the announcement chime but no announcement follows, go to the nearest staff room and lock the door. Rule 3. Never respond to anyone calling for help from the baggage claim after midnight. Rule 4. If you see a woman in a flight attendant uniform walking toward you, don't make eye contact. She doesn't belong here. Rule 5. Always complete your patrols by 2 a.m. and never stop walking until you've returned to the security office. It seemed odd. Gate 6? Why Gate 6? And a woman in a flight attendant uniform? What was that supposed to mean? I asked him about it, but he just waved me off. "Don't worry about it. Just stick to the rules, and you'll be fine," he said. The thing is, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't joking. There was something in his voice, something resigned, like he knew something I didn't. I didn't question him any further, figuring it was just typical paranoia on my part. After all, this was a new airport. It was bound to feel a little strange. That night, I settled into my routine. I did my patrols, checked the terminals, ensured the doors were locked, and made sure the few remaining workers stayed on schedule. It wasn't much different from any other night shift job I'd had. But then, around 1 a.m., I passed Gate 6. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. I stopped for a moment to check my flashlight. There was something off about the plane parked there. I don't know why I noticed it at first. Maybe it was the way the lights reflected off the sleek surface of the plane, or the way the shadows hung strangely on the boarding bridge. But there was something unsettling about it. The airport was still new, everything was freshly built, and yet the plane just seemed wrong. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. My feet were rooted to the floor, almost as if my body knew I shouldn't be there, knew I was about to break one of the rules. I told myself it was nothing. The plane was just a plane. It was safe. But then, I saw a figure moving in the cockpit window. No one had been scheduled to board that plane, and no one should have been on it. I forced myself to look away. The rule popped into my head again. Don't approach the planes at Gate 6, no matter how empty they look. I quickly moved on, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure. I knew I had to follow the rules. It wasn't worth risking anything. Around 2 a.m., I was finishing my patrol when I heard it, the soft chime of the announcement system. I froze. There was no announcement that followed it, just a faint ringing sound hanging in the air. I glanced down at my watch. 2:03 a.m. I remembered Rule 2. If you hear the announcement chime, but no announcement follows, go to the nearest staff room and lock the door. Without thinking, I darted toward the nearest staff room. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline kicking in. As I locked the door behind me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of impending dread. I crouched by the door, listening intently. The silence outside was suffocating. There was no sound at all, no footsteps, no hum of the air conditioning, nothing. Just a thick, unbearable quiet. After a few minutes, I finally took a breath and stood up. I was about to open the door when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming down the hallway outside the staff room. I froze again, my hand hovering over the door handle. The steps came closer and then stopped, right outside the door. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. My pulse hammered in my ears. The footsteps began to move again, but this time, they didn't pass by. They lingered. There was a soft tap on the door. Then silence. The handle jiggled once, twice, and then nothing. I waited a full 10 minutes before opening the door. The hallway was empty. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. It had to have been my imagination, right? Some tired part of my brain just playing tricks on me. The footsteps weren't real. I had to believe that. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I finished my patrols, made sure everything was locked, and did my best to ignore the lingering sense that something wasn't quite right. But when my shift ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next few nights were more of the same. Uneventful on the surface, but every time I passed Gate 6, every time I heard that chime and nothing followed, every time I heard faint voices from the baggage claim after midnight, I felt it. The weight of something pressing in on me, the knowledge that I was doing something wrong, that I wasn't supposed to be there. One night, it happened again. I was doing my rounds around 1 a.m. when I heard it, soft whispers coming from the baggage claim area. I was about to walk past, but then I remembered Rule 3. Never respond to anyone calling for help from the baggage claim after midnight. I hesitated. It sounded like someone was in trouble, but I knew better than to go near it. I kept walking, trying to ignore the voice calling for help. But the voice grew louder, more desperate. Help! Please, someone help me. My heart pounded in my chest. The temptation to help was almost overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't. I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't supposed to answer. I had to stick to the rules. I turned the corner and didn't look back. The voice stopped, just like that. The airport was silent again. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread as I continued my rounds. Something about that voice, something wasn't right. But I pushed it aside. I couldn't dwell on it. I had to stick to the rules. They would keep me safe. By now, I had gotten used to the eerie quiet of the airport. It wasn't exactly a place that felt alive. Every night, I walked the same empty halls, passing endless gates, quiet restrooms, and the occasional janitor doing their late-night cleaning. Despite the vastness of the airport, it was as though nothing ever moved here, like the entire place was frozen in time. But every night, I felt the same unsettling energy, that sense of dread lingering just at the edge of my awareness. It wasn't until the third week that it truly started to get under my skin. I had been walking past Gate 3, heading toward the staff room at the far end of the terminal, when I heard it again, the announcement chime. The soft, cheerful tone that was supposed to signal a new boarding call. Only this time, there was no announcement. The first time it happened, I wasn't sure what to think. The second time, I had locked myself in a staff room as I'd been instructed. But by now, I was starting to notice a pattern. This wasn't a random glitch. It seemed to happen regularly. I froze, listening to the chime echo in the distance. For a moment, I considered just ignoring it, moving on with my shift like any other. But I remembered Rule 2. If you hear the announcement chime, but no announcement follows, go to the nearest staff room and lock the door. I moved quickly, heading down the hallway to the nearest staff room, the familiar sense of panic starting to set in. The chime had a strange effect on me, like a switch was being flipped inside my head. It didn't matter that the building was empty, or that I hadn't seen another soul for hours. The moment I heard that chime, it was as if something primal inside me reacted, and I knew I had to hide. As I locked myself inside the small room, I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I could hear my heart thudding in my chest, louder than the chime itself. The silence on the other side was suffocating. I waited for what felt like forever. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No sounds. Just the silence, broken only by the occasional distant hum of machinery or the faint whir of the air conditioning. But then I heard it, the same slow footsteps that had followed me on my first night. The footsteps that seemed to echo in the empty hallways. They were growing closer. I crouched low, my flashlight clenched tightly in my hand. I told myself it was just another worker, maybe a janitor or maintenance staff. I tried to convince myself of that, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The steps stopped just outside the door. My blood turned to ice. I stayed absolutely still, holding my breath, not even daring to move. There was nothing, no tapping, no voices. Just the soft rustle of air in the hallway. The handle jiggled once, then stopped. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreat, getting softer and softer until they disappeared completely. I waited a full 15 minutes, still not daring to open the door. But when I did, the hallway was empty. The silence stretched on, but now it felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. A week after the incident with the announcement chime, I found myself once again patrolling the airport in the dead of night. It had become routine by now. There was nothing particularly exciting about the place, just long, empty corridors and the constant hum of the airport's HVAC system. The airport felt more like a museum than an operational hub, except there was something deeply unsettling about it. The more I spent time here, the more I began to realize that the airport wasn't just empty, it was still. Like the people and planes that were supposed to fill it had never truly existed. But there was one place I couldn't avoid, the baggage claim. It sat at the far end of the terminal, dark and silent at this hour. Every time I passed by it, I felt the same creeping unease, but tonight, I had a strange feeling that I couldn't ignore. As I neared the baggage claim area, I heard something. A voice. It was faint at first, muffled, as though coming from deep within the bowels of the airport. I stopped, straining to listen. Help me please." The voice was quiet but desperate. It sounded like a woman's voice, panicked, almost frantic. I hesitated. For a moment, I thought about heading over to check on whoever was in trouble. But then I remembered the rule. Never respond to anyone calling for help from the baggage claim after midnight. I should have walked away, ignored it, and gone about my shift. But something tugged at me, some sick curiosity that I couldn't shake. The voice was so real, so vivid. How could I just ignore it? I moved toward the sound, my footsteps echoing as I walked across the polished floor. The voice grew louder with each step, until I could almost feel it vibrating in my chest. "Please, I'm trapped, someone help." It was coming from behind the rows of conveyor belts, just out of sight. I stood there, heart racing, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to turn around and go back to the relative safety of the office. But another part of me, something darker, urged me forward. I rounded the corner, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, illuminating the empty baggage claim area. The conveyor belts were still, the lights dimmed, and there was no sign of anyone. But then I saw it. A figure, crawling from beneath one of the conveyor belts. It was a man, but his limbs were twisted in an unnatural way, contorted and bent at sharp angles. His face was obscured by his hair, but I could see his mouth open in a silent scream. I froze. The thing didn't look human, not entirely. It wasn't moving the way a person should, crawling in jerky, erratic motions. It was like watching a doll being pulled by strings, all wrong, all off. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to obey. I stood there, paralyzed, as the thing crawled closer, dragging itself across the floor with unsettling speed. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black, empty voids, staring directly at me. The voice from earlier, the voice calling for help, suddenly stopped, replaced by a low, inhuman growl. It was a sound that rattled my bones, a noise so full of malice and rage that it felt like it came from the very air around me. I managed to take a step back, but my feet were like lead, stuck to the floor. I could hear the thing's claws scraping against the tile, growing louder and louder. And then, without warning, it stopped. The thing just stopped. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was studying me. I couldn't breathe. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared back behind the conveyor belt. I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran. I had thought about quitting a lot. I even tried to leave a few nights ago. The terror had gotten to me, and I just wanted out. But then reality hit me. I couldn't afford to walk away. This job paid more than anything I'd ever done. I was behind on bills, struggling to make ends meet, and leaving meant going back to my old, miserable life. I didn't have a choice. I kept thinking about the money. The temptation of the paycheck, of stability, kept me here. And even if I wanted to leave, something in the back of my mind warned me that there was no way out. The next night, I was back on patrol, trying to shake off what had happened at the baggage claim. My heart was still racing from the encounter, and I couldn't stop thinking about the strange, twisted figure that had crawled from behind the conveyor belt. I knew I had to stick to the rules. The rules were my only way of staying sane in this place. As I walked past the gates near the main concourse, I felt a chill run through me, the kind that crawls down your spine like ice water. Something wasn't right. I glanced around, trying to shake off the sensation, but the feeling grew stronger. And then I saw her. She appeared at the far end of the hallway, just outside Gate 8, a woman in a flight attendant uniform. I didn't know why, but the sight of her made my blood run cold. She was walking slowly toward me, her steps almost too measured, too deliberate. There was something wrong with the way she moved, something that felt off, unnatural. I paused, trying to get a better look. Her face was obscured by the dim lighting, and her hair was slicked back, neatly styled like she had just stepped off a flight. But her presence, her energy, felt wrong. I recalled Rule 4. If you see a woman in a flight attendant uniform walking toward you, don't make eye contact. She doesn't belong here. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I had heard rumors about the woman in the uniform. Stories passed between the night shift workers about how she would appear out of nowhere, silently walking the terminal with no one ever seeing her get on or off a plane. But I had dismissed them as just that, rumors. Now, standing here in the hallway, I wasn't so sure. I turned quickly, lowering my gaze to avoid looking directly at her. The rules were clear. I quickened my pace, walking briskly toward the staff room. My fingers trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter. The sound of my own footsteps filled my ears, but the woman's footsteps didn't stop. She was still following me, but the sound of her heels on the floor was disturbingly muffled, as though they were not hitting the ground at all. I could feel her presence growing closer with every step I took, and then I did it. I made the mistake. I glanced up. Her face was pale, ghostly white, with hollow, dark eyes staring right through me. She had stopped walking, just a few feet away from me, her hand outstretched as though she were reaching for something. But not for me. No, it felt like she was trying to touch something behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. I didn't know where she went. I didn't see her walk away, didn't hear the sound of footsteps. It was as if she had melted into the air, disappearing without a trace. I bolted down the hallway, back to the security office, not daring to look behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop running. I locked myself in the office, my hands shaking as I leaned against the door. I knew the rules were there to keep me safe, but that moment, the woman, her eyes, was something I couldn't forget. The following night, I tried to put the previous night's incident behind me. I reminded myself of the rules, tried to focus on my patrol, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. The airport was never really quiet, not in the way it should have been. Even when I was alone, it was as if there was always a low hum in the background, almost like the place itself was alive, watching me. I had finished my first loop through the terminal when I reached Gate 6, a part of the airport I always avoided. The gate was mostly empty, the lights above flickering in a slow, rhythmic pattern. I never liked walking past Gate 6, something about it felt wrong. The emptiness of the gate seemed unnatural, and every time I passed by, I felt like I was being pulled in. It wasn't long before I heard the familiar sound that always made my heart skip a beat, the low hum of an airplane's engine starting up. But there was no plane. I stopped in my tracks. Gate 6 was supposed to be empty. There hadn't been any flights scheduled for hours. So why did it sound like a plane was warming up? I could see the reflection of the empty gate in the window. No plane in sight. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder and louder. My mind raced through the rules. Rule 1. Don't approach the planes parked at Gate 6, no matter how empty they look. I had heard whispers from the other staff members about Gate 6. How planes had been found there when they shouldn't have been. How workers had seen figures moving in the windows even though there were no scheduled flights. But I had never given it much thought until now. I forced myself to turn and walk away, my eyes fixed firmly ahead. But the sound grew louder, and before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the gate, unable to resist the pull. I don't know what happened next, but it felt as if my feet were no longer under my control. I found myself moving toward the gate, the sound of the engine thrumming in my chest. I reached the entrance, my hand hovering over the handle, but then, just as I was about to open the door, a voice inside my head screamed at me to stop. I yanked my hand back, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't do it. I couldn't approach the plane. I turned and ran, the sounds of the engine still echoing in my head, still tugging at me. I kept running until I was back in the staff area, locking myself in one of the rooms again. I didn't look back. After that night at Gate 6, things seemed to escalate. The unease I felt walking the empty halls grew into something deeper. The airport, which had once been nothing more than a cold, sterile building to me, now felt alive, watching, waiting for something. That night, I decided to stay close to the security office. I didn't want to take any chances. The thought of crossing paths with that woman in the flight attendant uniform again made my skin crawl. So I set out to complete my rounds in the areas I knew best: the lobby, the terminals, the staff rooms. I had just passed the restrooms near Gate 2 when I heard it, the sound of someone crying. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. The noise was faint, barely audible over the hum of the airport, but it was there. A soft sobbing, like someone in pain. It was coming from the baggage claim area again. My first instinct was to ignore it. After all, Rule 3 was clear. Never respond to anyone calling for help from the baggage claim after midnight. But this time I hesitated. The crying sounded so real, so human. I could hear the sharp, ragged breaths, the muffled sobs. It didn't seem like a trick, like the last time. I had learned a lot about the rules, the patterns, how to follow them to stay safe. But what if the rules weren't enough? What if they were there just to keep me away from something that needed help? I took a deep breath, fighting the rising panic in my chest, and forced myself to turn away. But the crying continued, now louder, more desperate. It clawed at my mind, making it harder and harder to ignore. I had only taken a few steps when I heard something else, a sharp, metallic sound, like a door slamming shut, followed by the unmistakable click of footsteps. Someone was walking toward me. I froze, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps were slow at first, deliberate, and then they picked up speed, getting closer. I could see nothing in the dim light of the terminal, but the presence, something unnatural, was there, just beyond my vision. I forced myself to keep moving, despite the panic clawing at my throat. My eyes darted around, but there was no sign of anyone. No one was walking through the terminal. No one was there at all. I started running. My feet pounded against the cold tile floor, echoing in the empty halls. The crying from the baggage claim was drowned out by the pounding of my own heart. But it wasn't just the crying that haunted me. It was the footsteps, getting closer, gaining on me with every stride. I didn't stop until I reached the staff room near the lobby. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving with panic. I wanted to scream, to shout out that I wasn't going back, but I knew that would only make it worse. I stayed in the staff room for what felt like hours, listening to the silence. The crying stopped. The footsteps stopped, but the fear didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for me in the dark, just outside the door, just beyond the safety of the locked room. The days started to blur together after that night. My shifts were becoming more of a nightmare than a routine. I kept seeing things in the corners of my eyes, shadows that moved just out of reach, reflections in the glass that didn't match up to the reality in front of me. I couldn't focus anymore. It was as if the airport was driving me mad, and I was just one step away from losing my mind entirely. The final straw came when I was making my usual rounds late one night. I had just finished checking Gate 7 and was heading back toward the security office when I noticed something strange. The lights at Gate 6 were on. I felt my heart skip a beat. Gate 6 was never used at this hour. There hadn't been a flight in or out of that gate in days. But now the lights were on, and the faint hum of an airplane engine echoed through the terminal again, filling the air with that unnerving noise. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the gate. I could feel the pull, that sensation again, urging me to go closer. I shook my head. No, I couldn't go near it. But the sound of the engine, it was like a compulsion, a pull I couldn't resist. I stepped toward the gate, my legs moving against my will. The closer I got, the louder the hum became. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to distort around me, warping, shifting like something was tearing at the fabric of reality. And then I saw it. There, parked at Gate 6, was a plane. But not just any plane. It was the same plane I had seen earlier, the one that wasn't supposed to be there. It was sitting there, illuminated by the harsh overhead lights, perfectly still, as if it had always been there. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to echo across the terminal. I turned around, heart racing, to find the security office just down the hall. I needed to get inside. I needed to lock myself in. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The woman in the flight attendant uniform. She was standing at the end of the hall, her dark eyes staring directly at me. I turned and bolted toward the security office, but I wasn't fast enough. Her hand reached out, and just before I could slam the door, she was there, blocking my way. I stumbled back, my body shaking with fear, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, dark, and full of malice. I could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I panicked. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay any longer. I turned, and with a burst of adrenaline, I ran for the exit. I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I wasn't coming back. I reached the parking lot in record time, my car in sight. The night air was cold, and the hum of the terminal seemed distant now. I fumbled with the keys, shaking hands making it hard to get the door unlocked. But as soon as I slid into the driver's seat, a strange calm washed over me. I started the engine. I was free. I could drive away from this nightmare. But then something felt off. I looked out the windshield, and for a split second, I thought I saw the airport's lights in the rearview mirror. I tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. My foot hovered over the gas pedal, but I couldn't make myself move. I was torn, stuck between wanting to escape and the fear that had me frozen in place. And just like that, my hand dropped from the wheel. My body tensed, and I felt this weird pull like something invisible had me locked in place. I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave. It wasn't just the rules anymore, though. Something else had its claws in me. I tried to shake it off, but it was like this invisible force was holding me there, keeping me stuck. The fear, the pressure, all of it. It was like a weight in my chest. I felt like I was being forced to stay. Before I knew it, I was back on my feet, heading back to the airport. It was like I had no control over what was happening anymore. Whatever had a grip on me was stronger than my will to leave. And there I was again, back inside the airport, caught in some endless cycle, unable to break free. The rules, they had me. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not ever. If you ever come across a job with rules like these, rules that make you question your sanity, don't take it. It's not worth the price you'll pay. And if you do end up there, don't even think about breaking the rules. You'll never leave. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more chilling tales.